Will there be a day after for Gaza? While Israeli officials draft plans for the continued occupation of a post-war Gaza Strip, the U.S. and the UN insist on an independent Palestinian state. Can a sustainable plan be found, or has the destruction gone too far? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Gaza. It may seem counterintuitive to talk about Gaza after Israel's assault. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he expects the war to continue until 2025. But still, Israeli officials have begun drafting plans for the so-called day after. And if you thought Gaza under Israeli occupation before was unjust, you should probably prepare to see worse. According to Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, Israeli control over everything that comes in and out of the Strip would continue. But within Gaza's borders, it seems Israel expects a multinational task force to rehabilitate the territory, even though many of those same countries already poured billions into rebuilding after previous Israeli attacks. But this time, nothing is left. Hospitals, schools, homes, and businesses are all wiped out, and the millions of lives that once walked through them are either dead or displaced. Here's a look now at Gaza and what might come if the war ends.
وقفوا لنا الحرب كفت تعبنا نفسيتنا تعبت كلنا تعبنا صغارنا راحوا وكبارنا راحوا كلنا رحنا كل العالم تتفرج علينا.
The suffering in Gaza is growing with no end in sight. Israel has killed more than 26,000 Palestinians, while 1.7 million have been displaced. Many lack access to food, water, and electricity. And on Thursday, those desperately seeking aid came under Israeli fire. And 3 months into the conflict, Israel has failed to achieve its so-called war objectives. This week, relatives of the Gaza hostages stormed a Knesset meeting, and protesters blocked the main highway in Tel Aviv, demanding the return of hostages.
We demand ceasefire. There is no military solution, only diplomatic solution. Only agreements will bring the hostages back.
Yet, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to keep fighting until eliminating Hamas.
Gaza must be demilitarized under Israel's full security control. I will not compromise on full Israeli security control of all territory west of the Jordan River. As Prime Minister of Israel, I have strongly upheld this position in the face of great international and domestic pressure. My insistence is what has prevented, over the years, the establishment of a Palestinian state that would have constituted an existential danger to Israel.
Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says Israel's repeated rejection of the two-state solution is unacceptable.
A lasting end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only come through a two-state solution. Israelis must see their legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see their legitimate aspirations for a fully independent, viable, and sovereign state realized in line with United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. Israel's occupation must end.
The U.S. has also shown its commitment to an independent Palestinian state. Earlier, Netanyahu rejected Washington's proposal for the Palestinian Authority to control post-conflict Gaza. And despite the U.S. objection to any change in the size of the Palestinian land, the Israeli military has demolished hundreds of buildings along the Gaza border to create a buffer zone.
We've been very clear our opposition to the forced displacement of people. We've been very clear about maintaining, in effect, the territorial integrity of Gaza, which is what you've alluded to, and a number of other critical principles, including Palestinian governance. Gaza reunified with the West Bank.
Washington also believes these prospects are crucial for Arab countries to fund rebuilding when the fighting stops. And that is already a costly task. Whole neighborhoods in Gaza have been razed to the ground. The Israeli offensive has destroyed health, education, and many other services. The Palestinian Investment Fund says at least $15 billion will be needed just for housing reconstruction. But as Israel prepares for a long war, it is unclear when there might be an end to the endless suffering.
Now, we have to remember that in 2018, the United Nations had already determined that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020, mainly because of Israel's decade-long blockade. Yet the Strip remained densely inhabited, only to have its infrastructure bombed further out of existence after October 7th. So, is there any basis to discuss a day after for Gaza? And joining me now to debate that and more are from Washington, Caroline Rose, the director of the Strategic Blind Spots Portfolio at the New Lines Institute. Also from the U.S. Capitol, author of The Words of My Father, Love and Pain in Palestine, Yousef Bashir. He's also a former member of the Palestinian diplomatic delegation to the U.S. And from New York is Kayum Ahmed, a special advisor on the right to health at Human Rights Watch. Thanks all so much for being with me. Caroline, I will start with you. I mean, should anyone be talking about a day after at this point, given the destruction is ongoing, or is it irresponsible not to discuss it because it will have to come one day, even if in 2025?
Certainly. Well, I think that we've seen preliminary reports of a, quote, day after plan that was submitted to the Israeli cabinet. And it reflects this, quote, third phase in Israel's operation into Gaza. It does not name what authority, political power would be transferred to. Instead, keeping it extremely ambiguous and also noting that Israel would technically withdraw, but then, of course, ensure that Hamas does not stay in charge. This, of course, does not help us identify a clear picture of what a reconstruction program would look like, nor any sort of strategic plan that would ensure Palestinian civilians to return back to a potential normal, if that is even possible. I think that these plans are important to talk about, but of course, it's still important to note that Israel has not necessarily defined its operational timeline in Gaza. And at this point, it seems to be acting extremely unilaterally without, without much coordination with partners at this point. And because of this, I think that we're seeing a dangerous escalatory ladder emerge in Gaza without a real clear plan in sight.
Right. Caroline, quickly, I mean, does Israel have to act like it's somehow taking responsibility and being proactive, even when it knows none of what it's proposed will actually work at this point?
Absolutely. And I think that it can introduce this third phase while still being in the second phase of heavy strikes and heavy operations. And it's notable that in this, quote, day after plan, Israel said that this phase would still allow it to conduct military operations well into the Gaza Strip. So because of this, are we in phase 2? Are we really in phase 3? What really could that really be classified as reconstruction? And I think these questions are very important to ask as different cabinet members and officials within Israel circulate these, quote, reconstruction plans, when really they are not planning on ending these strikes into Gaza anytime soon. Right.
So, second phase or third phase, Yousef, no political power has been identified, but Israel just says it will not be Hamas. So Israel's notion of the war ending when Hamas is eliminated, Israel knows Hamas is not just an armed resistance. It is an ideology that they are only making stronger through this assault. So is saying that they're attacking Hamas actually just for cover to eliminate Gaza while they do so?
Well, maybe, but I don't think that Israel needs a cover to eliminate Gaza. Israel has been carrying out a relentless effort to make life impossible for people in Gaza. I have family in Gaza. I have friends in Gaza. I've grown up in Gaza. I left in 2006, and even in 2006, it was my reasoning behind leaving Gaza was to
find... I mean, the cover doesn't fool you. You are there, but it is something that its allies in the United States and the EU, for example, want to hear.
Sure. Sure, but and this is the question we're talking about the day after. The Palestinian opinion, people who are on the ground, people who are in Gaza, are there to and who are based in the United States and in Europe, are there to refute that approach by the Israeli government. It's not accurate, it's not right, and it's not moral.
And meanwhile, we're having this debate over, or I shouldn't say we are, the United States, for example, and the UN and the EU and Israel are having a debate over a two-state solution being an option in the end. Tell me if you think, Yousef, it is time to recognize that Israel will never accept a two-state solution, that it would feel far too threatened to ever have a fully sovereign Palestinian state on its border, given the history of what it's done to the people there. So what are we talking about here, a two-state solution? Is it just, as we keep hearing over and over now, a Bantustan that they're proposing?
I do not think that the Israeli leaders since 2007 have been committed to any notion of a two-state solution. The Israeli government, under the leadership of Netanyahu, has publicly and bluntly told the United States and the entire international community that it is not committed to such a solution. And let's judge it by just the past few days and a few months, where the Netanyahu has rebutted and rejected every American notion of any talk of a two-state solution. And not only that, but he is continually rejecting any presence of a Palestinian Authority, an entity that works on security matters with the Israel and the West Bank. So this regime, this government, as we know it, as we judge it by its actions and statements every day for the last 17 years, it's absolutely not committed to this two-state solution. However, it is committed to playing games with the United States and Europe and the rest of the international community to play for time and to impose its version of a status quo and, impose a reality. We keep hearing the Israeli narrative over the past 17 years, especially regarding settlements. Well, the reality on the ground suggests otherwise. It's complicated. The government could fall if we do such and such. There is no commitment on the other side, and this is the biggest problem and the biggest threat we face as Palestinians today.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. Kayum Ahmed, I'll come to you, because as for the status quo, the occupation and the blockade, it worked for Israel. Life went on pretty peacefully for Israelis. And for Palestinians, life somehow managed to go on. Can it return to that? We've heard so many say there's no going back at this point, but it seems that Israel has a plan to do just that.
I completely agree with you. I think that Israel has a plan to do so, but their plan centers Israel and rather the voice of Palestinians. And so I think there are a couple of principles that we must apply that have to be applicable to the rebuilding process in Gaza. I think the first and most important principle is that Palestinians must be at the center of any rebuilding effort. While the international community has, I believe, a legal duty and obligation to support the rebuilding of Gaza, Palestinians must decide for themselves what this rebuilding process should look like. I think, secondly, when Gaza is rebuilt, we cannot simply return to the Gaza of October 6th. Before the Israeli bombardment started on October 7th, Palestinians were still living under an occupation. Gaza was still subject to an unlawful blockade, and Palestinians were still being dehumanized by Israel's crimes of apartheid. And we therefore have to rebuild Gaza in a way that advances the human rights of Palestinians rather than taking them back to October 6th. And I think thirdly, I've learned as a subject of South African apartheid for the first 18 years of my life, that rebuilding a country requires so much more than just money or infrastructure or politics. It requires the rebuilding of a people. In other words, the psychological and emotional dimensions of the rebuilding process are just as important as the economic and political elements. And I think these principles should inform the rebuilding of Gaza.
Right. But I mean, Kayum, when you look at that now, when you look at Gaza now, I mean, is it even possible to resurrect? I mean, starting with your specialization, the health and medical infrastructure that's been destroyed. How do you even reestablish basic services and then try to even rebuild an economy from there? Like I said at the top, if the UN said that Gaza was going to be unlivable by 2020, and it did go on to meet all those definitions of being an unlivable territory, what is it now? How do you even begin rebuilding a life where anyone can even have a sense of real dignity, given the state it's been
Indeed.
left in?
Indeed, I think the rebuilding of the health infrastructure in particular is going to take decades, perhaps several generations, assuming, of course, that Israel upholds its obligations under international law. It's going to involve rebuilding hospitals and clinics, but also training a new generation of nurses and doctors, since approximately 400 healthcare workers have been killed by Israel between October 7 and January 23. I'm currently working with healthcare organizations in Gaza to investigate the detention of approximately 200 Palestinian healthcare workers since October 7. So the situation is catastrophic. But I also think that the rebuilding of the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza must go beyond humanitarian aid. Simply putting a plaster or a band-aid on a gaping wound. Palestinians should not simply be reduced to becoming recipients of humanitarian aid that is determined and delivered by Western governments and international organizations. Palestinians don't need white saviors. They have some of the best trained healthcare workers in the world and must be given the autonomy and the authority to determine what a post-apartheid Palestinian healthcare system should look like.
Sounds ideal. I just don't know how it gets there. I mean, Caroline, who's even supposed to rebuild this? They're talking about a multinational force coming in, but again, you have EU and Arab countries who've already poured billions into rebuilding this territory after Israel destroyed it in attacks before. Now you're looking at absolute destruction. Who's responsible this time? Who's really going to invest?
I think that ultimately, when it comes to this question of who will take the greatest responsibility, thus far we're seeing just a few answers. As of now, when it comes to Israel, I think that my colleagues are right in the sense that the main priority and the objective here for Israel is to stave any sort of strong reemergence of Hamas operations against Israel. And because of that, when it comes to this, quote, rebuilding or day after plan, it's not about Palestinians. It's about establishing some sort of ambiguous authority, allowing for daily, weekly, annual operations into the Strip, and that be that. Do some of the bare minimum infrastructural rebuilding that is required and allow for Israel to continue to conduct these operations. Now, when it comes to other sorts of rebuilding plans, I think that that's extremely unclear. And I think that a negotiated ceasefire is going to determine a lot of what countries will commit resources and propose different plans, as well as what Israel will also allow to operate within the Strip. Because as of right now, with this phase 3 plan, it's clear that Israel is seeking to hold these reins and try and determine the outcome and access into the Strip as well, which is extremely important to know.
You mentioned an ambiguous authority, Caroline. Well, first of all, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has said that there will be no Israeli civilian presence in Gaza, i.e. settlers will not be allowed to return. Some still question that. But that also Israel will retain operational, I think called it operational freedom of action. What is that exactly? I mean, again, are we just talking about this ambiguous authority being another Bantustan, somehow being able to co-opt any Palestinian so-called leaders that they will leave in charge or approve of being in charge that they won't designate as a threat to the state of Israel? What is it?
Certainly, I think that with this, we could expect continued Israeli ground and potentially even air operations well into the Strip whenever they want. This, of course, can include, for example, seeking to mitigate tunnel systems within the Strip. We've seen those operations play out before. We could, of course, also see ground offensives or small special operations against different networks that are deemed to be Hamas affiliated. This could play out in so many different ways, but I think it is extremely important to note that Israel is trying to keep that operational ambiguity and keep that door open for continued strikes, operations, activity within the Strip as long as they want, as well as, of course, keep that that question of control and access up to the Israeli government.
Yousef, we've heard people describe this almost as a silver lining thing, that this is a turning point now, that things will have to change, and that they can't get worse. Do you see that?
After 26,000 people killed, 60,000 wounded, many thousands more still under rubble, I can't imagine any worse than that. All the stories that I've grown up hearing about from teachers and friends and elderly in growing up in Gaza, I never imagined that I would live to see them in action. I've seen glimpses of that in 2014, 2009, 2012. But this time it's a sophisticated effort to wipe out Palestinians in Gaza, and I don't think that it can get any worse. I guess if Eliyahu decides to drop a bomb on Gaza, a nuclear bomb, then I guess there's more to this debate. But today and the last 3 months have been absolutely catastrophic, and I can't imagine it being any worse for the people in Gaza.
Okay, then what about those, Yousef, who think that Israel does have a grand plan to somehow push Palestinians in the West Bank somehow into Jordan, Palestinians in Gaza somehow into Egypt or elsewhere, and somehow resettle Gaza for themselves in the name of Israeli security and self-defense? Do you think that's impossible?
I don't think so, because looking at the history of the conflict, Israeli responses to any Arab-Palestinian attacks, retaliations, whatever we want to call them, has always been military action combined with settlements, especially in the West Bank. Wherever there's an activity carried out by Palestinians, whether organized or not, the response is a settlement. And security and soldiers follow that settlement. So I don't take I take their announcements. Yesterday, 2 days ago, there was a conference in Israel attended by Likud members about resettling Gaza. So I take that very, very seriously. I grew up next to a former Israeli settlement by the name of Kfar Doron, next to my house in Deir el-Balah. So I take those threats very seriously. They make me very concerned, and I think that the world should take them seriously as well. Jordan, Egypt are opposing, but I also cannot take their opposition seriously as well, because I know that they coordinate on other matters as well. From a Palestinian citizen perspective, this is a very worrying threat that I don't even think that the United States will be even capable of stopping if the political environment in Israel is geared towards that.
Yeah, that's another debate, whether the U.S. does truly wield power over Israel at this point or not. But Kayum, let me turn to you for one last issue. We're seeing the ICJ begin to dish out some sort of ruling, at least guidelines for where it's going. It hasn't ruled on genocide yet, but it has denied Israel's request to dismiss the case against it and to allow humanitarian aid. It said that South Africa's accusations are plausible. So right now, it's a positive outcome for the South African case of genocide against Israel. Do you see that case amounting to anything qualitatively for Palestinians right now in Gaza?
That is an excellent question and really hard to fully articulate and understand. I think what it symbolizes is some sort of faith in the international system, which has up to now failed Palestinians. In December last year, we celebrated 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, which of course is the same year that the Nakba started in 1948. And so 75 years of apartheid against Palestinians. And so I think the ICJ case is a bit of light at the end of a dark tunnel, suggesting that the international community is going to come together to support Palestinian liberation.
Okay.
I think the South African case in particular is critical, and I think more countries need to support South Africa's attempts at using international law to hold Israel accountable.
Kayum Ahmed, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me on this edition of The Newsmakers. Great to have you all, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.